She checked into a resort on a private island to mend her broken heart. And the man she met on a secret beach wasn't just a simple fisherman, he was the reclusive billionaire who owned it all. One hidden path changed everything. If you love luxury romance stories, don't just watch, subscribe now and join our family. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? I'd love to know. The air that greeted Ashley Bogart on Serafina Key was a thick, fragrant blanket of salt and wild jasmine, a world away from the sterile, recycled air of her museum archives. The private water taxi had deposited her on a dock of impossibly white wood, leading toward the gleaming glass and mahogany entrance of the Ethelred Resort. Every penny of her savings, the fund once meant for a down payment on a house, had been poured into this 1 week of solitude, a desperate attempt to glue back the pieces of a heart shattered by a very public, very humiliating broken engagement. This level of luxury was so far removed from her reality that it felt like a dream. Inside the lobby, the cool, polished marble under her simple sandals seemed to whisper that she did not belong. The staff moved with a silent, choreographed grace, their smiles polite but distant as they confirmed her reservation. She felt their eyes glance over her off-the-rack sundress and the single worn suitcase she carried herself. She wasn't one of them, the effortlessly wealthy who vacationed in places like this. She was just a tourist in their world, a temporary guest in a life of unimaginable opulence, trying to outrun the ghost of a man who had called her life's passions quaint. Her bungalow was a masterpiece of understated elegance, with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed a perfect postcard view of the turquoise ocean. The scent of fresh lilies hung in the air, and the bed was a cloud of white linen so pristine it felt wrong to sit on it. Yet as she stood in the center of the room, a profound sense of emptiness washed over her. The silence here was manicured, managed by soundproofed walls and the gentle hum of the climate control. It wasn't the raw, healing silence of nature she had craved, but a gilded cage of quiet. A restless energy propelled her from the room. She needed to feel sand between her toes, not just see it from a distance. Ignoring the pristine pathways designed for golf carts, her eyes caught a barely there trail near the edge of the resort's property, a faint parting in the lush emerald foliage. It was unkempt, wild, and utterly irresistible. It promised an escape from the curated perfection, a path to something real and untamed, something that might actually quiet the storm inside her own mind. The further she walked, the more the resort's symphony of hushed conversations and distant, gentle music faded, replaced by the roar of the untamed sea. The air grew thick with the smell of damp earth and salt spray as the manicured gardens gave way to dense, tangled jungle. Palm fronds brushed against her arms, leaving trails of moisture on her skin, and the path became rougher, forcing her to watch her step. With every footfall, she felt like she was shedding a layer of the manufactured world she had just paid so dearly to enter. And then, the trees opened up and she gasped. Before her lay a perfect crescent of sand, a secret beach untouched by the resort's meticulous hand. Driftwood lay scattered like ancient bones on the shore, and the water crashed against volcanic rock formations with a power she could feel in her chest. It was here, in this raw and beautiful solitude, that she finally felt her shoulders begin to relax. This was the place she had been searching for, a corner of the world that had not been polished and perfected for public consumption. It was only then that she saw him. Near the dark rocks, a man sat with his back to her, entirely absorbed in his task of mending an old fishing net. He wore simple, faded linen trousers and nothing else, his sun-kissed skin blending with the warm sand. There was a stillness about him, a quiet competence in the movement of his hands that suggested he was not a guest, but a part of this island's soul. He seemed to belong to the sun and the salt, in a way no one in the luxurious resort ever could. Ashley took a hesitant step forward, and a dry twig snapped under her foot, with a sound that seemed to crack the serene atmosphere like a whip. The man's hands stilled, and he slowly turned, his head lifting to look at her over his shoulder. His eyes, the color of the sea just before a storm, were not startled or annoyed, but filled with a calm, patient curiosity. He offered a small, disarming smile that seemed to crinkle the sun-weathered corners of his eyes, and the knot of anxiety in her stomach loosened just a fraction. "A little off the beaten path, aren't you?" His voice was a low, gentle rumble, almost lost beneath the sound of the crashing waves, yet it carried to her with perfect clarity. It was a voice that held no judgment, only a simple observation. Ashley felt a flush of warmth creep up her neck, feeling like an intruder on his private sanctuary. "I was just exploring," she managed to say, her own voice sounding thin and unfamiliar to her ears. The main beach felt a little crowded with emptiness. He seemed to understand that contradiction perfectly, giving a slow nod as his gaze drifted from her face to the horizon. A subtle shift in the light was occurring, the brilliant gold of the afternoon sun slowly being muted by a veil of high grey clouds gathering in the distance. He had an intimate familiarity with the sky, reading it like a map she couldn't comprehend. He wasn't just looking at the weather, he was listening to it, sensing a change long before she could. "You'll want to start heading back soon," he said, his tone shifting from casual to one of gentle, practical concern. "The storms on this side of the island don't give much warning. They're not like the gentle showers over the resort." The words hung in the air, a quiet assertion of a knowledge that was local and deep, a secret the glossy brochures would never share. In that moment, he established himself as the guardian of this small, wild world, and she was merely a visitor. As if summoned by his words, the first drop of rain fell, fat and warm, on her bare arm. Then another, and another, dotting the pristine sand around them with dark circles that grew larger with each passing second. The wind began to whip her hair across her face, and the sea's gentle roar intensified into a hungry growl. The vast open beach suddenly felt exposed and vulnerable, and the manicured safety of the resort felt 1,000,000 miles away. A different lifetime. He stood up in one fluid motion, his tall frame a steady presence against the rising wind. He gestured with his chin toward a small, weathered cabin she hadn't even noticed, tucked discreetly among the sea grape trees at the edge of the jungle. It looked old and sturdy, as much a part of the landscape as the rocks themselves. "We can wait out the worst of it in there," he offered, his voice calm and even, a stark contrast to the growing chaos of the elements around them. Ashley hesitated for only a heartbeat, her gaze shifting from the dark, churning sky to his steady, reassuring eyes. Running back along the slippery, unknown path seemed far more dangerous than accepting the shelter offered by this quiet stranger. There was a sense of raw, elemental safety with him that the resort's sterile perfection could never provide. She gave a small, definitive nod, a silent surrender to the storm and to him. He held out his hand, not to command but to guide, and she knew that taking it would change more than just her path back to the resort. His fingers closed around hers, his grip firm and calloused, a grounding force against the sudden chaos of the wind. There was no hesitation in his touch, only a simple protective instinct as he led her at a quick pace toward the cabin. The rain came down in sheets now, instantly plastering her thin dress to her skin and sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. They reached the wooden door just as a low rumble of thunder echoed across the sky, and he pushed it open, guiding her into the sudden, encompassing quiet within. The air inside was cool and smelled of cedar, old books, and the faint, pleasant aroma of brewed coffee. It was a single Spartan room, but it was meticulously cared for. A simple bed was neatly made in one corner, a worn leather armchair sat near a small stone fireplace, and shelves crammed with books lined one entire wall. There was no electricity, only oil lamps and a profound sense of peace. This small rustic space felt more authentically luxurious than the entire opulent resort she had left behind. A sanctuary built by hands, not by a corporation. Noah moved with a quiet efficiency, seemingly unbothered by the storm he had predicted. He lit a brass oil lamp with a match, and a warm golden glow bloomed in the dim light, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. He turned to her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light, and handed her a thick, rough-spun towel from a nearby hook. "Here," he said simply, his voice that same low, calming rumble. "You're soaked." The words were practical, yet they felt layered with an unspoken tenderness. Ashley wrapped the towel around her shoulders, the coarse fabric a welcome friction against her chilled skin. It smelled of sun and sea air, a clean, masculine scent that she instinctively knew was his. She watched as he moved to the fireplace, his back to her, and began to expertly lay kindling. The simple domestic act was mesmerizing. She could see the lean, powerful muscles in his back shift under his damp shirt, a quiet strength in every deliberate movement. He was completely at ease here, a king in his small wooden castle. "I don't think my travel agent mentioned a monsoon season," she said, attempting a light-heartedness she didn't quite feel. Her voice was breathy, and she hugged the towel tighter around herself, suddenly aware of how she must look, a drowned rat who had stumbled into a stranger's home. He glanced over his shoulder, the corners of his eyes crinkling again as he offered that small, genuine smile. "They sell the sunshine and edited skies," he replied. "But the island gives you what you really need, not always what you want." The words settled between them, imbued with a meaning that went far beyond the weather. The storm raged outside, the sound of the rain on the tin roof a relentless, rhythmic drumming that seemed to isolate them completely from the rest of the world. They were in a bubble of warm light and growing heat from the nascent fire, the universe shrinking until it contained only the two of them. It was a forced proximity that felt less like a trap and more like a fateful, inevitable meeting. He turned fully to face her then, the fire now catching and casting a warm, orange glow on his face, illuminating the deep, oceanic blue of his eyes. He wasn't just looking at her. He was seeing her, not as a guest, not as a woman in a wet dress, but as a person who had wandered off a path and found him. There was a recognition in his gaze, a quiet understanding that made her feel more exposed and more safe than she had felt in years. He watched her as if he could see the parts of her she thought were invisible, and she found herself hoping he would never look away. The initial chill in her bones began to recede, replaced by the radiant warmth of the crackling fire. The adrenaline of being caught in the storm slowly gave way to a much quieter, more potent feeling, a charged awareness of the man sitting just a few feet from her. He had taken the armchair, leaving her the small wooden bench by the hearth, a gesture of unassuming hospitality that spoke volumes. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood and the unspoken questions that hung between them in the cozy silence. "Tea?" he asked, his voice soft as if not to disturb the fragile peace they had found. Before she could answer, he was already moving toward a small kitchenette area, his motions economical and sure. He pumped water from a vintage-style hand pump into a kettle, a rustic detail that fascinated her, and set it on a small cast-iron stove. He moved like a man who had stripped his life down to the essentials, finding a profound satisfaction in simple, deliberate actions. Ashley pulled the rough towel tighter, feeling a sudden need to anchor herself. "Thank you," she murmured, watching him. "You seem very prepared for this." He brought back two mismatched ceramic mugs, their imperfections adding to the cabin's charm. "I prefer the island's version of reality," he said, handing one to her. "It's honest. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not." His words felt like a gentle probe, an invitation to share something real. "I think I needed some of that honesty," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. She looked down into the empty mug in her hands, its earthy texture a comfort. "The world I come from is filled with edits, polished surfaces and careful omissions." She didn't say her ex-fiancé's name, but the phantom of his memory was there, a ghost of curated perfection and hollow promises. Noah just nodded, his gaze patient, letting her words settle without trying to fix or fill the silence that followed. She looked up at him, a flicker of curiosity overriding her shyness. "And you? Is this your home?" she asked, gesturing vaguely at the cabin around them. A shadow of something complex and unreadable passed through his eyes before he answered. "It's my sanctuary," he said, the choice of words deliberate. "It's where I come to remember who I am when the world tries to tell me I'm someone else." It was a cryptic answer, but it resonated with a truth so deep it made her ache. The kettle began to whistle, a cheerful, piercing sound that cut through the tension. He poured the steaming water over tea leaves in their mugs, and the fragrant scent of chamomile and mint filled the small space. He handed her mug back, his fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting electric moment. Her breath caught in her throat. A simple, accidental touch had sent a jolt of heat straight through her, sharp and undeniable, making her skin tingle long after he pulled away. He sat back down, his expression calm, but she saw the subtle shift in his posture, the way his jaw tightened for just a second. He had felt it too. The storm outside had created a shelter, but inside a different kind of electricity was building, a quiet, intense energy that had nothing to do with the weather. The air was thick with the things they weren't saying, with the space between them that felt both vast and impossibly small. He looked at her lips, then back to her eyes. and a silent promise passed between them in the storm-lit quiet. Ashley cradled the warm mug in her hands, its heat seeping into her palms, a welcome anchor in the swirling current of her thoughts. The tea was fragrant and soothing, but it did little to calm the rapid, insistent beat of her heart against her ribs. The silence that fell between them now was different. It was no longer a comfortable quiet, but a space filled with a palpable humming tension. Every crackle from the fireplace, every drop of rain on the roof seemed to amplify the unspoken awareness that connected them. She risked a glance at him from under her lashes. He was staring into the fire, his profile etched by the flickering orange light. His features were strong, carved with a quiet intensity, but there was a softness around his mouth that suggested a kindness he kept guarded. He seemed lost in thought, and she wondered what worlds existed behind those stormy blue eyes. Was he thinking about the life he lived here, in this beautiful, isolated simplicity, or was he thinking about her, the unexpected woman who had literally washed up on his shore? "Ashley," she said suddenly, the name feeling foreign on her own tongue after days of silent introspection. "My name is Ashley." She needed to ground this encounter in reality, to give herself a name and an identity beyond that of a half-drowned tourist. He turned his head slowly, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that made her feel like the only person in the world. "Noah," he replied, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle deep in her chest. "It's good to meet you, Ashley." The simple exchange of names felt monumental, a formal acknowledgement that something significant was happening between them. It was a bridge built across the chasm of their different worlds, a fragile connection forged in the heart of a storm. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between them that was more intimate than any words could be. She saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes, a hint of a loneliness that mirrored her own. To break the intensity, she looked around the cabin again, her archivist's eye drawn to the details. She noticed a series of framed architectural sketches on the wall, exquisitely detailed drawings of structures that seemed to grow organically from their landscapes. They were brilliant, masterful. "Did you draw these?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "They're incredible. They seem to understand the land they're built on." A flicker of surprise and then pleasure crossed his face. "I did," he admitted, a note of quiet pride in his voice. "It's what I do. Or what I used to do mostly. I try to create spaces that listen to their surroundings." He spoke of his passion with an understated reverence that she, a woman who catalogued the passions of others for a living, found deeply compelling. It was another piece of him, another layer to the man who mended fishing nets and predicted storms. He stood and walked over to the sketches, pointing to one of a house built into the side of a cliff, overlooking a wild sea. "This was the idea," he said, his voice soft, almost wistful. "To build something that doesn't impose but belongs." As he spoke, he stood close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell the faint, clean scent of his skin beneath the aromas of rain and wood smoke. Her entire being was acutely aware of his proximity. He turned his head slightly, his gaze dropping from the sketch to her face, and her breath hitched. The space between them was electric, a magnetic field of unspoken possibility. His eyes were so close now, she could see the flecks of grey and green within the deep blue like the ocean itself. Her own reflection was captured there, small and wide-eyed. Her lips parted slightly, an involuntary invitation as the entire world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them in the warm, fire-lit glow of the cabin. The storm outside was a distant, muffled roar, its power dwarfed by the tempest brewing within these four walls. Noah's gaze traced the line of her jaw, lingered on her mouth, and then rose again to meet her eyes. Asking a silent question, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of anticipation and fear. This was happening too fast with a stranger she'd only just met, and yet it felt more right, more fundamentally true than anything she had felt in years. It was a connection that bypassed logic and went straight to the soul, a recognition of a kindred spirit in the most unexpected of places. He lifted his hand, his fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second in the air, before gently brushing a damp strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was feather-light, yet it sent a searing trail of heat across her skin, raising goosebumps in its wake. The gesture was so tender, so full of a reverence she had never experienced, that it made her throat tighten with emotion. He wasn't just touching her hair, He was touching the vulnerability she had tried so hard to hide. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of what could happen next. She could lean into his touch, close the small distance between them, and discover what his lips felt like. The thought sent a dizzying surge of desire through her, a longing so sharp and immediate it startled her. But the ghost of her past, the painful memory of misplaced trust, held her captive. She had come here to heal, to build walls around her heart, not to let a handsome stranger with soulful eyes tear them down before the mortar was even dry. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she took a small, almost imperceptible step back. The movement was tiny, but it was enough to break the spell. The charged energy between them fractured, and Noah immediately dropped his hand, his expression shuddering as he masked his disappointment with a neutral calm. He had read her signal perfectly, respecting the boundary she had drawn without a word needing to be spoken. His consideration in that moment was more seductive than any kiss could have been. "The storm seems to be letting up," he said, his voice a little rougher than before. He turned away from her and walked to the cabin's single window, peering out into the twilight. The rain had indeed softened from a torrential downpour to a steady, gentle drumming. The worst had passed. The bubble of their forced proximity was about to burst, and the reality of their separate worlds was waiting just outside the door. A sudden, sharp pang of regret pierced through her. The moment was gone, lost to her fear. He stood at the window, his back to her, a solid, lonely figure against the fading light. He had offered her a glimpse of something real and beautiful, and she had shied away. The silence was no longer filled with romantic tension, but with the quiet hum of a missed opportunity, a question left unanswered. She watched him, her heart aching with the promise of what she had just refused. The door clicked shut behind her, and Ashley was instantly enveloped by the sterile, manufactured perfection of her bungalow. The silence in this room was nothing like the peaceful quiet of his cabin. This was an empty, echoing void. The opulent space, which had seemed like the pinnacle of luxury just hours before, now felt cold and impersonal. She could still feel the phantom warmth of his hand on hers, a stark contrast to the chilled, climate-controlled air that brushed against her skin. She walked on numb feet to the enormous window, overlooking the now calm ocean, its surface glittering under a newly revealed moon. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and sparkling, but a new turbulence was churning inside her. She replayed the moment by the fireplace, the intense look in his eyes, the gentle way he had reached for her. He had offered her a moment of pure, unguarded connection, and her own fear, a deep-seated reflex from a past betrayal, had caused her to retreat into her shell. A wave of regret, so sharp and painful it made her gasp, washed over her. It wasn't just a missed kiss. It was a missed opportunity to feel something real. Noah's immediate, unquestioning respect for her unspoken boundary was a gesture of profound kindness, a stark contrast to her ex-fiancé who had always pushed and prodded at her emotional walls. This quiet stranger, this man of the sea and storms, had shown her more genuine consideration in 2 hours than she had known in 2 years. She spent the rest of the evening in a state of restless agitation. She tried to read the novel she had brought, but his face kept appearing between the lines. She tried to order room service, but the thought of the resort's gourmet food felt unappealing compared to the simple, fragrant tea he had made for her in his mismatched mug. The entire luxury experience she had bankrupted herself for had been rendered meaningless by the authentic warmth of a small, wooden cabin. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with dreams of stormy seas and the scent of wood smoke. She woke with the sun, a decision already formed in her heart, solid and clear. She couldn't let it end like that, as a strange, beautiful interlude in a lonely vacation. She didn't know his story or what he was doing on this island, but she knew with a certainty that resonated deep in her bones that she had to see him again. She had to understand the connection that had sparked so instantly between them. The next morning, the resort was a picture of serene perfection. Guests in expensive linen lounged by the infinity pool, their laughter tinkling like ice in crystal glasses. Ashley walked past them all, a woman on a mission, her bare feet finding the hidden path as if drawn by an invisible string. The jungle was damp and alive, steaming in the morning sun, every leaf glistening with the remnants of the storm. Her heart pounded with a mixture of hope and a terrifying vulnerability. She stepped out onto the secret beach, her eyes scanning the familiar cove, searching. The sand was smooth and empty, the driftwood undisturbed. The cabin stood silent and still, its windows dark and its door firmly closed. There was no sign of him. There was no sign that the magic of the previous night had ever happened at all. Her hope faltered, leaving an aching emptiness in its place as she realized he was nowhere to be found. A profound disappointment settled over her, heavy and cloying in the humid morning air. She stood at the edge of the trees, feeling foolish. Of course he wasn't here. He was probably a local fisherman or a caretaker who had his own life, his own schedule. Why would he be waiting here for the woman who had shied away from his touch? The vibrant, sunlit beach felt mocking in its beauty, a stark contrast to the intimate, storm-shrouded haven it had been just last night. She walked slowly toward the cabin, her footsteps the only sound besides the gentle lapping of the waves. She half expected the door to be locked, to find the entire place to be as inaccessible as the man himself. But a deeper part of her, the archivist who believed every object held a story, felt compelled to look closer, to search for any trace that what she had experienced was real. She needed proof that the connection wasn't just a fantasy conjured by loneliness and a dramatic change in air pressure. Hesitantly, she climbed the 2 small wooden steps onto the porch. She peered into a window, but the angle was wrong and the dim interior revealed nothing. She ran a hand along the weathered wood of the doorframe, the texture rough and real under her fingertips. It smelled of salt and cedar, the same scent that had clung to the towel he had given her. It was real. He was real. The memory was not a dream, and that knowledge was both a comfort and a fresh sting of pain. She was about to turn away, to retreat back to the hollow perfection of the resort, and accept the encounter as a fleeting, beautiful memory, when her eyes caught something out of place. Tucked into the frame of the door at eye level was a single perfect wildflower. It was a deep velvety blue, the exact color of his eyes, and its petals were still dotted with fresh morning dew. It hadn't been there during the storm. It had been placed there this morning. Her breath caught in her throat and her heart began to beat a little faster. It was a sign. It wasn't an overt invitation, not a note with words and instructions, but a quiet, poetic gesture. It was a piece of the island's wild beauty, left for her to find. It was a statement that was perfectly in character with the man she had met, understated, thoughtful, and deeply connected to the natural world around him. This was his way of communicating. She gently plucked the flower from the doorframe, its stem cool and delicate against her fingertips. She lifted it to her nose, inhaling its faint, sweet scent, a fragrance that was now inextricably linked to him. This small flower was a question and an answer all at once. It said I was here. I was thinking of you. The connection was real. It was an offering, a breadcrumb on a trail she was now determined to follow wherever it might lead. A renewed sense of purpose surged through her. He wasn't gone. He was simply somewhere else on this island, a place she now felt a desperate need to explore. The resort with its infinity pools and champagne brunches faded into the background, an irrelevant distraction. Her real vacation, her real journey was the search for the man with eyes the color of the sea and a soul that spoke in wildflowers. She knew, with a certainty that thrilled her, that he was waiting for her to find him. Clutching the small blue flower as if it were a precious jewel, Ashley walked away from the secret beach with a newfound sense of clarity. The path back to the resort no longer felt like a retreat into a gilded cage, but merely a stepping stone. Her mission had changed. She was no longer here to hide from her past. She was here to chase a potential future, however fleeting it might be. The island had transformed from a place of escape into a map, and Noah was the treasure she was determined to find. She strode through the pristine lobby, her bare feet and determined expression turning a few heads among the immaculately dressed guests. She approached the concierge desk, a bastion of polite corporate efficiency. A young woman with a perfect smile and a name tag that read Chloe looked up. "Good morning, Miss Bogart. Can I arrange a spa treatment for you today? Or perhaps a tea time?" Her voice was smooth and rehearsed, offering a menu of pre-approved luxury experiences. "Actually," Ashley began, placing the delicate blue flower on the polished marble countertop. "I was hoping you could tell me about this." Chloe's smile faltered for a microsecond as she glanced at the wildflower. It was a piece of the untamed island, a thing that did not belong on her sterile, organized desk. "It's very pretty," she said, her voice regaining its professional sheen. "I'm afraid I'm not a botanist. Our resort's horticulturist curates our gardens. But anything beyond the property line is—" She trailed off, the word irrelevant hanging unspoken in the air. "I'd like a map of the whole island, then," Ashley pressed, undeterred. "Not just the resort grounds. I want to see the other parts, the natural parts." Chloe's smile tightened. "For your safety, Ms. Bogart, we strongly advise guests to remain within the resort's designated areas. We cannot guarantee the same level of service or security beyond our perimeter." It was a polite, firm dismissal, a clear indication that her desire for authenticity was an inconvenience. Ashley felt a familiar frustration bubble up inside her. It was the same polished condescension her ex-fiancé had used, the gentle steering away from anything that wasn't controlled, approved, or easily monetized. But this time she refused to be managed. As Chloe turned to attend to a ringing phone, Ashley's eyes scanned the area behind the desk and spotted him, an older man in a groundskeeper's uniform, his face weathered and kind, waiting patiently to speak with the concierge. He held a pair of pruning shears in his gnarled hands, and he was looking at her flower with a knowing expression. Ignoring the concierge, Ashley picked up the flower and walked directly to the man. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft. "I was wondering if you knew what this is called, or where I might find more of them." A genuine warm smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "The sky gazer," he said, his voice raspy and pleasant. "A stubborn little flower. Doesn't like the rich soil in the gardens. Only grows up on the northern ridge, near the old lighthouse point. Needs the wind and the poor soil to get that color." He gave her simple, clear directions, speaking to her not as a guest to be managed, but as a fellow human being who appreciated the island's true beauty. The northern ridge, lighthouse point. The names were a melody, a destination. She thanked him profusely, her heart soaring with gratitude and a fresh surge of adrenaline. She now had a heading, a real place to go, a tangible thread to follow in her search for Noah. She realized she hadn't just been given directions. She'd been given the key to unlock the island's secrets. Following the groundskeeper's directions, Ashley bypassed the fleet of guest-ready golf carts and found a rugged service path at the edge of the property. The air changed almost immediately. The carefully curated floral scents of the resort gave way to the rich, damp smell of earth and wild vegetation. The manicured lawns were replaced by tangled undergrowth and ancient moss-covered trees that canopied the trail, dappling the ground in shifting patterns of sunlight and shadow. This felt real, vibrant, and thrillingly unpredictable. The path began to climb, and with every step, a sense of quiet exhilaration grew within her. This was an adventure of her own making, a stark contrast to the passive, curated luxury she had been prescribed. She felt her senses sharpen, noticing the iridescent flash of a hummingbird's wing, the rustle of some small creature in the bushes, the ever-present sound of the sea breathing below. She was no longer just a visitor looking at a beautiful view. She was a part of the landscape, moving through it with purpose. After nearly an hour of walking, the path opened onto a breathtaking vista. She had reached Lighthouse Point. The old lighthouse itself was a beautiful weathered stone structure, standing as a silent sentinel on the edge of a dramatic cliff. And just beyond it, nestled into the landscape so perfectly it seemed to have grown there, was a house. It was a stunning piece of architecture, a symphony of natural wood, glass, and local stone that echoed the sketches she had seen in Noah's cabin. But on a grand, magnificent scale, her heart began to pound, a slow, heavy rhythm in her chest. This had to be his. It was a space that didn't dominate the cliffside but listened to it, just as he'd described. As she drew closer, a sound drifted toward her on the gentle sea breeze, a sound so unexpected and beautiful it made her stop in her tracks. It was the clear, melancholic notes of a piano, a melody that was both complex and deeply emotional. A song filled with a quiet, powerful longing, drawn by an irresistible force. She moved toward the house, her steps silent on the soft grass. The music grew louder, pouring from a series of massive glass doors that were slid open to the ocean air. She crept to the edge of the veranda and peered inside. The interior was a vast open-plan space, furnished with a minimalist elegance that bespoke immense wealth and impeccable taste. And there, at a gleaming black grand piano, sat Noah. He was no longer the simple rustic man from the beach. He wore a soft, dark-colored shirt and tailored trousers, his bare feet resting on the pedals. He was completely absorbed in his playing, his eyes closed and his body swaying with the emotion of the music. The raw, untamed energy she had sensed in him was still there, but now it was channeled into a display of breathtaking artistry and sophistication. The truth crashed over her with the force of a tidal wave. This was not a fisherman's sanctuary. This was the home of the billionaire who owned it all. The final, heartbreakingly beautiful note of the song hung in the air for a long moment, then faded into silence. He let his hands fall from the keys, and then, as if he had sensed her presence all along, he slowly turned his head and looked directly at her. His gaze met hers across the expanse of polished stone and shimmering glass, and in his eyes she saw no surprise, only a deep, profound sadness. The beautiful, haunting melody he had been playing still echoed in the vast room, a ghost of the intimacy she had believed was real. But the man at the piano and the man who mended nets in a rustic cabin were two completely different people, and the realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She felt a hot, sickening flush of humiliation creep up her neck. Every cryptic phrase he'd uttered suddenly clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The island gives you what you really need. It's where I come to remember who I am when the world tries to tell me I'm someone else. He hadn't been a simple man seeking refuge from the world. He was the king of that world, momentarily stepping down from his throne to play a part. And she, with her broken heart and desperate search for authenticity, had been the perfect, naive audience for his little performance. Noah rose from the piano bench, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were approaching a startled animal. He didn't speak, which was somehow worse. The silence allowed her imagination to run wild, painting her as a fool, a charity case, an amusing diversion for the reclusive billionaire who owned this entire perfect island. The stunning house, with its priceless art and panoramic views, no longer felt beautiful. It felt like a cage, a testament to the insurmountable chasm between their lives. "You're him," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "You're Noah Croft." It wasn't a question, but an accusation. The name felt heavy, a brand of unimaginable wealth and power. It was the name discreetly etched on the resort's welcome sign, the name synonymous with the very opulence she had both craved and resented. The man who had listened to her with such patient understanding was a lie. "Ashley, please," he said, his voice the same low, resonant timbre she remembered, but it sounded different in this cavernous room. It was the voice of a man accustomed to command, softened for her benefit. "Let me explain." He took a step closer, but she instinctively took a step back, the veranda's edge at her heels. The trust that had bloomed so quickly in the storm-tossed cabin had withered just as fast under the harsh sun of this new reality. The simple, calloused hands she had found so compelling were attached to a man who could buy and sell her entire world without a second thought. The quiet sanctuary hadn't been his escape from a simple life. It had been his escape from this life. He hadn't shared his world with her. He had hidden it. The shared vulnerability she had felt, the sense of being truly seen, now felt like the most cutting kind of deception. "There's nothing to explain," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. She turned to flee, to run back down the path to the sanitized, predictable world of the resort, a world where at least the lies were printed on glossy brochures. She couldn't bear to look at him for another second. The man who embodied the beautiful, impossible dream and the crushing, painful reality all at once. She had to escape the man who had made her feel more seen and more foolish than anyone in her entire life. The man in the cabin was not a lie. His voice stopped her, cutting through the swirling chaos of her thoughts with its raw sincerity. It wasn't a command, but a plea. She froze with her back to him, her hand gripping the edge of the veranda railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. She could feel his presence behind her, a warm magnetic pull she was fighting with every ounce of her willpower. She refused to turn, refused to let him see the tears welling in her eyes. "That man is the one I fight to keep alive," he continued, his voice closer now. "He's the reason that cabin exists. He's the reason I learned to mend a fishing net and read the sky for storms. Because this," she heard him gesture vaguely to the magnificent room behind them, "this is a construct. It's a beautiful hollow shell, filled with expectations and projections. People don't see me in here, Ashley. They see a name, a number in a bank account." He was standing right behind her now. She could feel the heat of his body, could smell the same clean sea salt scent she remembered from the storm. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was an embrace in itself, a silent request to stay, to listen. "You told me you came here to escape a world of polished surfaces and careful omissions," he said softly. His voice a low murmur meant only for her. "I heard you. I understood you because I live in that world every single day." His words, the echo of her own confession, struck a chord deep within her. He had been listening. He had remembered. She slowly turned to face him, her tear-filled eyes finally meeting his. The sadness was still there, but now it was laced with a desperate earnestness. She saw past the expensive shirt, past the aura of wealth, and saw the same lonely soul she had connected with in the flickering firelight. "The cabin isn't an escape from my life," he clarified, his gaze intense and unwavering. "It's an escape to my life, to the real part of it, the part that feels grounded and honest. And I didn't want this," he swept a hand around the room again, "to taint that, to taint the first real conversation I've had in years. I was trying to protect it, to protect us." The last word was barely a whisper, a fragile admission of the hope he had harbored. The narrative in her head began to shift. He hadn't been playing a part to mock her. He had been protecting himself just as she had been. He had created a boundary around his true self, a secret beach where he could be Noah, not Noah Croft. And she had stumbled into that sacred space, and for a few precious hours, they had both been real. The slow burn of their connection hadn't been a lie. It had been the only truth in a world of artifice. The anger and humiliation began to dissolve, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. He was just as trapped in his gilded cage as she had been in her life of quiet disappointments. He wasn't the villain of her story. He was a fellow prisoner, dreaming of a world that valued substance over style. He saw the shift in her expression, the softening of her eyes, and a flicker of hope ignited in his own. "Why didn't you just tell me?" Ashley's voice was soft, stripped of its earlier anger, leaving only a raw, bruised vulnerability. The question was simple, but it held the weight of her entire conflict. He let out a long, slow breath, a sigh that seemed to carry years of loneliness with it. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration and fatigue that was so endearingly human, it made her heart ache. "Because the moment I say, 'I'm Noah Croft,' everything changes," he explained, his voice low and laced with a weary resignation. "The conversation becomes an interview. The person's eyes glaze over with dollar signs. They start seeing opportunities, angles, leverage. The authenticity is gone forever. I get a carefully curated version of them, a performance designed to impress the billionaire." He looked at her, his expression pleading for her to understand. "With you. For the first time in I don't know how long, I wasn't the billionaire. I was just Noah, and you were just Ashley. And it was real." She could see the truth of his words reflected in her own behavior. Hadn't she felt immediately inadequate in the resort's opulent lobby? Hadn't she judged herself based on her simple dress and worn suitcase? His wealth created an immediate imbalance, a power dynamic that would have made the easy, honest connection in the cabin impossible. He hadn't lied to her out of malice. He had omitted the truth out of a desperate desire for normalcy, a desire she understood all too well. "That wildflower," she said, thinking of the small, brave gesture. "The groundskeeper called it a sky gazer. He said it only grows where the soil is poor." The parallel was not lost on her. He had offered her a symbol of beauty that thrived not in cultivated luxury but in hardship. It was a piece of his true self, the self that preferred the wild, windswept ridge to the manicured gardens below. It was an apology and an invitation all in one. A small, sad smile touched his lips. "It's my favorite," he admitted. A reminder that the best things don't need to be pampered and protected. They just need the freedom to grow. He took a tentative step closer, and this time she didn't retreat. He slowly reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them for a moment before he gently, reverently touched her cheek. His thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't even realized had fallen. The contact was electric, a current of pure, unadulterated feeling that grounded her in the moment. All the noise, the shock, the anger, the confusion, faded away, leaving only the quiet, profound truth of his touch. He wasn't a concept, a billionaire on a magazine cover. He was a man, warm and solid and real, whose presence made her feel a sense of homecoming she had never known. This was the protective hero she hadn't known she was looking for. "I am so sorry, Ashley," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry I hurt you. I was selfish. I wanted to keep that moment in the cabin, that feeling of being seen for who I am, for just a little while longer. I never meant to make you feel like a fool." His apology was absolute, stripped of ego or justification. It was a complete surrender, an offering of his own vulnerability to match hers. She leaned into his touch, a silent act of forgiveness and acceptance, closing her eyes as the warmth of his hand spread through her. The tension that had held her body rigid for the past hour finally dissolved, leaving her pliant and soft in his presence. She opened her eyes, her gaze locking with his, and in that shared look a new understanding was forged. The slate had been wiped clean, the misunderstanding replaced by a raw and fragile honesty that was more intimate than any conversation they'd had before. The grand, sun-drenched room no longer felt intimidating. It was simply the space that held them, a silent witness to their reconciliation. "Show me," she said, her voice a quiet request. "Show me your world. The real one. Not the resort. Not the shell. You." The word hung in the air between them, an invitation for him to be the man from the cabin and the man from the mansion, all at once. She wanted to see the pieces of his life, to understand how the man who played Rachmaninoff with such breathtaking passion was the same one who found solace in mending fishing nets. A look of profound relief washed over his features. So powerful it was, as if he had been holding his breath for a decade. He gave her a small, genuine smile, the one that crinkled the corners of his eyes, and it was like the sun breaking through the clouds. "I'd like that," he said, his voice imbued with a warmth that enveloped her. He kept his hand on her cheek for a moment longer, before letting it drop, the absence of his touch leaving a lingering tingle on her skin. He led her not through the opulent living areas, but down a simple hallway to a closed door. When he opened it, her breath caught in her throat. It was his architectural studio, a creative sanctuary filled with drafting tables, rolls of blueprints, and stunningly detailed scale models of buildings that seemed to defy gravity. The walls were covered in his sketches, the same ones from the cabin and dozens more. It was a space of genius, passion, and immense dedication. It was the heart of who he was. "This is my center," he said, his voice filled with a quiet reverence. "Everything else, the business, the meetings, the brand, it all exists to fund this. This is the part that's just mine." He walked her through the room, explaining his philosophies, how he saw buildings as living things that needed to breathe with the landscape. He spoke not with the arrogance of a billionaire, but with the infectious passion of an artist sharing his soul's work. She listened, completely captivated, tracing the lines of a model with her fingertips. She saw the connection between the grand, sweeping lines of his designs and the simple, perfect curve of a seashell. He saw the world in a way she, as an archivist who preserved the past, found utterly fascinating. He was a man who built the future, but did so with a deep, abiding respect for the natural history of a place. They were two sides of the same coin, preservation and creation. He watched her as she explored his world, a look of open admiration in his eyes. He saw the genuine curiosity and intelligence in her questions, the way her entire being lit up when she spoke of art and history. He wasn't just showing her his work. He was showing her himself, and she was not only understanding, she was appreciating. The invisible wall of his wealth had crumbled, leaving behind only two people sharing their deepest passions. Knew then that letting her into his sanctuary was the best decision he had ever made. He led her out of the studio and onto a secluded stone terrace that seemed to float above the ocean. A simple wooden table and two chairs were positioned in the shade of a gnarled ancient olive tree, overlooking a view so spectacular it felt painted. The endless expanse of turquoise water met a sapphire sky at the horizon, a perfect, unbroken line. The air here was different, cleaner, filled with the scent of sea salt and the faint, sweet perfume of sun-baked stone and wild herbs growing in crevices. Noah disappeared for a moment and returned with a tray. It held not champagne and caviar, but a simple porcelain pot of tea, two familiar mismatched mugs from the cabin, and a plate of sliced mango so vibrant and fresh it looked like captured sunlight. The gesture was so thoughtful, so attuned to the simple connection they had first forged, that it spoke more loudly than any grand romantic display ever could. He was showing her that he remembered what was real between them, As they sat, a comfortable silence settled, a stark contrast to the charged quiet of their earlier encounters. This was a silence of peace, of mutual understanding. The luxury surrounding them was undeniable, the perfectly designed house, the priceless view, but it faded into the background, becoming nothing more than a beautiful setting for the simple act of two people sharing tea. The core of their connection, the slow burn of attraction and recognition, was independent of the scenery. "I haven't shown that studio to anyone in 5 years," he said softly, breaking the quiet. He wasn't looking at her, but out at the horizon, his profile serene. The last person who saw it immediately started talking about leveraging the designs for a new line of branded hotels. He couldn't see the art. He could only see the asset. He paused, then turned to her, his gaze clear and direct. "You saw the art. You saw the soul in it." Ashley felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. He wasn't just complimenting her. He was validating a part of herself she had been taught to believe was impractical and unimportant. Her ex-fiancé had always dismissed her passion for history as a cute hobby, but Noah, a man who built the future, saw value in her reverence for the past. He saw her, and he respected what he saw. "I spent my life cataloging the stories objects tell," she replied, her voice steady. "Your designs, they tell a story of respect for the land, of wanting to create a legacy that's more than just a name on a building. It's a beautiful story." She took a sip of her tea, the familiar taste of chamomile and mint a soothing balm. It felt as if they were picking up a conversation that had been interrupted, not by a storm but by the intrusion of the outside world. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, creating a small, intimate space between them. "Tell me your story, Ashley Bogart," he said, his voice a low, gentle command. "Tell me about the museum, the artifacts you love, the life you left behind to come here." It was a genuine inquiry, an invitation to reveal the parts of herself she kept hidden. He wasn't asking to be polite. He was asking because he truly wanted to know, and so for the first time in a very long time she did. She spoke, and he listened. He didn't just hear the words. He absorbed them, his intelligent eyes never leaving her face, his expression a mixture of empathy and fascination. She told him about the quiet, dusty archives, the thrill of holding a forgotten piece of history in her hands, the secret life of the city she lived in, told through faded letters and cracked pottery. She spoke of her passion not as a job, but as a calling, a way to connect the present to the past. She even told him about the broken engagement, the story tumbling out of her with a surprising lack of pain. In the safety of his presence, the memory lost its sharp, humiliating edges. It became just a fact, a chapter in her life that had led her improbably to this terrace with this man. She described the crushing realization that her fiancé had never seen her, only a version of her that fit into his perfectly curated life plan. Noah listened without interruption, without judgment. When she finally fell silent, a little breathless from the confession, he didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. Instead, he simply said, his blindness was a cage for you both. He couldn't see the masterpiece in front of him, and you couldn't see the bars he was building around you. His insight was so sharp, so accurate, that it resonated through her like the striking of a bell. He had summed up 2 years of her life in 2 perfect, empathetic sentences. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the olive tree above them, creating a dancing pattern of shadows on the table. He reached across the small space and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. His touch was warm and sure, an anchor of solidarity. It wasn't a gesture of seduction, but of profound connection. It said, "I see you. I have been there too. We are not alone." The forced proximity of the storm had been replaced by a chosen proximity, a deliberate, conscious closing of the distance between their souls. "My world is much the same," he confided, his voice a low rumble. "People project their dreams of wealth, of power, of fantasy onto me. I've become a symbol, not a person. It's profoundly lonely." He squeezed her hand gently. "Until a woman with sad, beautiful eyes and a fierce love for the stories of the past stumbled onto my beach, looking for something real." The way he said it, so simply and with such open vulnerability, made her heart feel like it was expanding in her chest. This was the intimacy she had been craving, not just a physical closeness, but the alignment of 2 souls who had felt unseen by the world, finally finding recognition in each other's eyes. The slow burn had been leading to this, a moment of quiet, perfect emotional nudity. The luxurious setting was irrelevant. They could have been in his cabin or her tiny apartment. The magic wasn't the island, it was them. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was achingly tender, a promise of a care and reverence she had only dreamed of. It was more intimate than any kiss on the mouth could have been, a seal on the unspoken pact that had just been made between them. She knew, in that moment, that she could trust this man with the fragile, healing pieces of her heart. The afternoon sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in strokes of soft gold and rose. The transition from day to evening was seamless, marked only by the shifting colors on the water and the gentle cooling of the air. Ashley and Noah remained on the terrace, the world shrinking to the small, intimate circle of the olive tree's shade. They talked for hours, the conversation flowing as effortlessly as the tide, moving from their shared passions for art and history to their secret fears and quiet, unfulfilled dreams. She learned about the immense pressure he had been under since inheriting his family's empire at a young age, the constant battle to stay true to his artistic vision in a world that only valued profit margins. He spoke of his parents, who had loved the idea of his success but had never truly understood the soul of the artist within him. He was a man who had everything the world could offer, yet he had been starved of the one thing he craved most, genuine, unconditional acceptance. He, in turn, learned about the quiet strength that lay beneath her gentle exterior. He saw the fierce intelligence in her eyes when she debated a historical point, the deep well of passion she possessed for her work, and the resilient spirit that had carried her through a soul-crushing heartbreak. He realized that her quietness wasn't a sign of weakness, but a sign of a rich inner world, a world she only invited a select few to enter. He felt an overwhelming sense of privilege to be allowed inside. As dusk settled, casting a velvety purple hue over the sea, Noah stood and held out his hand. "For there's one more place I want to show you," he said, his voice soft in the twilight. She placed her hand in his without hesitation, a silent affirmation of her trust in him. He led her back through the now darkened house, their footsteps echoing softly on the stone floors, and out to a different part of the property, following a path lit by low, discreet lights. The path ended at a small, secluded cove, even more private than the one where they had first met. Here the water was placid, protected by an embrace of dark, volcanic rock. In the center of the cove, the ocean glowed with an ethereal, otherworldly light. It was bioluminescence, millions of tiny organisms creating a submerged galaxy of shimmering, dancing blue-green stars. The sight was so magical, so breathtakingly beautiful. It seemed to be a secret the universe had saved just for them. "I come here when the noise of the world gets too loud," he whispered, his voice full of a quiet reverence as they stood at the water's edge. "It reminds me that there's a different kind of light, a different kind of power, something wild and beautiful that can't be bought or sold or engineered." He was sharing the most sacred part of his sanctuary with her, the heart of his island's magic. It was the ultimate gesture of trust, the final brick in the wall of his solitude being removed just for her. He turned to her, his face illuminated by the faint, magical glow from the water. In his eyes she saw a reflection of the starlit sea, and a vulnerability so open and profound it made her breath catch. The protector, the billionaire, the artist, all of those personas fell away, leaving just Noah, a man who had found something precious and was terrified of losing it. He lifted his hand, his fingers tracing the curve of her jaw with a touch as light as a whisper. And she knew this was the moment she had both feared and longed for. The magical, pulsating light from the water cast shifting patterns on his face, illuminating the undisguised emotion in his eyes. The rest of the world ceased to exist. There was only the soft, rhythmic sigh of the waves, the cool sand beneath her feet, and the warmth of his hand against her skin. This time, when he leaned in, she didn't retreat. She met him halfway, rising on her toes to close the final, agonizing inch that separated them. His lips met hers with a gentle, questioning pressure, a moment of pure, reverent tenderness. It wasn't a kiss of hungry passion, but of profound discovery. It was soft and slow, a silent conversation that communicated everything their words had not. It tasted of salt and the cool night air, and it felt like coming home, A deep, shuddering sigh escaped her, a release of all the loneliness and fear she had been carrying for so long. He responded to her surrender by deepening the kiss, his other hand coming up to cup the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair. It was a gesture of both possession and protection, a claim that was also a promise. The slow burn that had been simmering between them for days finally ignited, not into a raging inferno but into a deep, radiant heat that spread through her veins, warming her from the inside out. This was not the fleeting, performative affection she had known before. This was real. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. He looked down at her, his eyes dark and serious in the ethereal glow. "Stay," he whispered, the single word a raw, desperate plea. "Don't go back to the resort tonight. Stay here. With me." It wasn't an invitation to his bed, but an invitation into his life, into the sanctuary he had so carefully guarded. She knew what he was asking. He was asking her to trust him completely, to step out of the carefully defined role of a resort guest and into the beautifully uncertain territory of being his. It was a risk, a leap of faith into a world of wealth and power she couldn't possibly comprehend. But looking into his eyes, she realized the greater risk was walking away. The greater risk was returning to her old life, forever haunted by the ghost of what could have been. "Okay," she breathed, the word a promise. A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face, a smile of such pure, unadulterated joy that it lit him up from within. He had let her in, and she had chosen to stay. The balance of their worlds had shifted, tilting on the axis of a single perfect kiss. The forced proximity of the storm had evolved into the deliberate, chosen intimacy of this moment. He took her hand, his fingers lacing tightly with hers, and led her back toward the house. The path was no longer just a path. It was a bridge between their separate realities. The house was no longer his fortress of solitude. It was about to become their shared sanctuary. Every step felt momentous, a footfall into a future that was terrifying and exhilarating and utterly unknown. She was no longer just a guest on his island. She was a guest in his heart, and she knew she might never check out, of course. Here are the final 2 chapters, 19 and 20. He led her not to a grand, impersonal guest suite, but to a quiet wing of the house that felt distinctly his. The space was a continuation of the man she was coming to know, warm, understated, and filled with art and books. He opened a set of glass doors to a private balcony, and the sound of the waves became the room's gentle, rhythmic heartbeat. There was no awkwardness, no pressure, only a shared sense of peaceful inevitability. They had crossed a threshold, and this quiet, shared space was the new reality they were building together. Noah left her for a moment and returned with 2 glasses and a bottle of water, a simple gesture that was more intimate than uncorking the most expensive champagne. He handed her a soft cashmere throw blanket, its texture a whisper of the life he lived, but he offered it for her comfort, not as a display. He sat not beside her on the bed, but in a worn leather armchair nearby, giving her space, respecting the monumental step she had just taken. His consideration was a constant, reassuring presence. "I used to sit out here for hours," he said, his voice a low murmur in the quiet room, trying to imagine what it would be like to share this view with someone. Not a guest or a business partner, but someone who could see what I see. His gaze drifted to the moonlit ocean, then back to her, and the unspoken part of his sentence hung in the air. "Someone like you." He was sharing the contours of his loneliness with her, trusting her with the most vulnerable parts of his heart. Ashley pulled the soft blanket around her shoulders, the luxurious fabric a cocoon of warmth and safety. "I used to sit in my archives," she confessed, her voice equally soft, "and I'd read old love letters from 100 years ago, and I would try to imagine what it felt like to be loved that completely, with a passion that was worth preserving in ink." She looked at him, and in his patient, empathetic eyes, she saw the echo of that same timeless longing. They didn't need to fill the silence with meaningless chatter. They let the quiet spaces exist, comfortable in the shared understanding that had grown between them. It was a testament to the strength of their connection that they could simply be together, without performance or pretense. She felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, a feeling that had been absent from her life for so long she had forgotten what it felt like. Here in the billionaire's mansion, she felt more at home than she ever had in the life she'd built for herself. Later, as a deep, bone-weary exhaustion from the emotional day began to set in, he stood. He walked over to the bed, and for a heart-stopping moment she thought he was going to join her. Instead, he simply reached down and pulled the edge of the duvet up, tucking it gently around her. He brushed his lips against her forehead, a kiss as soft and chaste as a blessing. "Sleep, Ashley," he whispered. "You're safe here." He turned and walked to the door, leaving her in the quiet sanctuary of the room. The closed door was not a barrier, but a profound sign of respect. He was a protective hero, not in a grand sweeping gesture, but in the quiet, considerate way he guarded her peace. He was giving her the one thing she had craved more than anything, a place where her heart could finally, truly rest. She closed her eyes, the scent of the sea air and the phantom touch of his lips lulling her into the deepest, most peaceful sleep she had had in years. Ashley awoke to the soft grey light of dawn filtering into the room. For a moment, she was disoriented. The unfamiliar ceiling and the sound of the ocean a gentle puzzle. Then the memories of the previous day washed over her. The piano, the confession, the bioluminescent water, the kiss. A slow, warm smile spread across her face. It hadn't been a dream. She pushed back the covers and walked to the balcony, the cool morning air a refreshing caress on her skin. Below, on the stretch of private beach in front of the house, Noah was standing at the water's edge. He was dressed in the same simple linen trousers she remembered from their first meeting, his feet bare in the wet sand. He was watching the sunrise, a solitary, pensive figure against the vast pastel-colored canvas of the sky. As she watched him, she understood. This was his ritual. This was how he grounded himself, how the billionaire remembered how to be the man. She quietly made her way down and out of the house, her own bare feet silent on the sand as she approached. He didn't seem surprised to see her, turning as if he had been expecting her, a soft, welcoming smile on his face. He held out his hand and she took it, lacing her fingers through his as they stood together, watching the sun climb higher, painting a glittering path across the water directly to them. This was the forced proximity trope made real, but it was a proximity they had both now chosen. "I checked into a resort on a private island to escape my life," she said softly, her voice filled with wonder. And the man on the secret beach was the billionaire who owned it all. She was speaking the title of her own story, the hook that had pulled her into this new reality. It sounded absurd, like the plot of a romance novel, but it was true. And the truth was more beautiful and more complex than any fiction. Noah turned to face her, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheekbones. His expression was serious, his blue eyes searching hers with an intensity that reached straight into her soul. "That man is still here," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And he's not letting you go. Not back to the resort, not back to your old life. Unless that's what you want." It was the ultimate question, the point of no return. She looked into his eyes, the eyes that held the same wild, beautiful honesty as the island he loved. She saw her future there, a future that was terrifying and unknown, but filled with the promise of a love that saw all parts of her. The archivist, the dreamer, the heartbroken woman, the resilient survivor. He wasn't offering her his wealth. He was offering her his world, his whole complicated, beautiful heart. "What I want," she said, her voice clear and strong, "is the man who mends fishing nets and the one who plays the piano. I want the man who hides in a cabin and the one who builds masterpieces. I don't want to check out, Noah. I want to stay." It was her answer, her commitment, her own grand emotional climax. He closed his eyes for a second, a look of overwhelming relief on his face, before he leaned down and sealed her promise with a kiss that was not about discovery, but about forever. If this story touched you, don't leave without subscribing. Your support means everything. Hit the bell so you never miss the next luxury romance, and tell me in the comments, from which country are you watching tonight? I can't wait to know.